So hello, everyone. Welcome to our four-part series on Swedenborg 101. And my name is Reverend Rich Taffel. I'm the pastor at Church of the Holy City in Washington, D.C. And we're going to review Swedenborg's biography. We figured that's a good place to start before we get into his thoughts and his theology and his impact. We'll be covering various parts of that. But this week, it's just pretty much the story of the person Emanuel Swedenborg. And of course, there's whole biographies written about Emanuel Swedenborg, nice, thick, long, big books about it. And we're going to try to squeeze it into, probably a half hour of kind of just reviewing the highlights of his life and then have time for discussion. So each week we will have time for discussion. And if you have a question when I'm presenting, because it will be a little bit more of like a lecture format, just raise your virtual hand and I can stop and answer a question so you don't, if you feel like I'm really not following this. And again, I'm not a Swedenborg scholar, actually, so I'm doing the best I can and pulling together what I know and seeing if I could condense this person's life into a short biography today. So any questions before we get started? And thank you all for being here, but any questions before we get started? Okay, so let's go into the life of Emanuel Swedenborg. And the first thing about Emanuel Swedenborg was he was not born Emanuel Swedenborg. He was born Emanuel Swedberg. His name was ennobled. His family was ennobled, and they changed it to Swedenborg. So he's born Emanuel Swedberg. He became Emanuel Swedenborg. So and he has a noble family. And so his years, I always like to know like kind of what the span of the years of a person are. So his years are 1688 to 1772, and he was born and lived primarily in Sweden. He actually died in London, and we'll get to that later, but he lived to be 84. So if you think about that time period, 84 was a very ripe old age. So he had a nice long life. His life spans a really significant cultural shift in the world. It's the time of the rise of the Enlightenment that was unfolding through Europe, and he really fits in as an iconic Enlightenment thinker. He was famous in his time as a scientist, and he traveled in the circles of the Enlightenment thinkers, particularly in the Netherlands and in France, but primarily in England, where he spent a lot of time. And so he is really known in his day as a scientist. We'll get into that. And then has a moment in his life that really changes things. And he has this mystical experience. And that's the mystical side that most of us are probably more interested in and more aware and curious about. And it's much more of his legacy today. His dad was a prominent Lutheran bishop and in Sweden, and the family was from a wealthy mining family. And I think to think about mining in Sweden at this time is to think about oil in Texas. Today, mining was it meant that you were from a wealthy family if you were involved with mining. So he had that on his father's side, and he will eventually have it on his mother's side, and he will have it in his career. So you think mining, what's the big deal about mining? Mining was a big deal. It was the source of a lot of wealth for the country. He was raised in a very strong Christian faith, but as he grew older, he became dedicated to the physical sciences, and that's where he wanted his career. What's interesting, at least from my perspective, I really believe that his scientific curiosity and his scientific rigor become really important to his mystical path. So a lot of times we look today as do you believe in science or do you believe in spirituality? He is an integration of both science and spirituality in one person. And I would say in his time, that was not as unusual as it might be today. I think the great Enlightenment thinkers generally were very informed by their spirituality. So, he was a bright kid, it appears to me, and I would say a child of privilege. And at 11 years old, he was enrolled in the University of Uppsala. His father was a teacher there and would also go on to be a bishop in the Lutheran Church, so prominent family. Very shortly thereafter, his brother dies, his mother dies, his dad remarries, and he's one of 9 children. And the family that he marries into, the father marries into, is a wealthy mining family as well. So just a little, it's always interesting to know kind of the economic background of a person. I did find this note that he wrote to somebody about his early years, and it shows that he was on a spiritual path as a young kid. From my 4th to 10th year, I was constantly engaged in the thought of God, salvation, the spiritual sufferings of men, and several times I revealed that at which my father, and so much so that my parents wondered about it. From my 6th to 12th year, my delight was to discourse with clergymen concerning faith and life and love, and the love that gives life in the neighbor. So he's already very much, as a young kid, thinking theological thoughts. It wasn't just completely like a switch goes off in his life. So after he finishes studying in Sweden, he does what generally wealthier kids could do in those days. He traveled throughout Europe and studied throughout Europe. And there's letters back and forth. And I would say my interpretation of him is a very smart kid, and a kid of privilege. You know, he's wanting, you know, more money. Like most kids write to their parents, you know, send me more cash. I need to do this, I need to do that. So very typical, but the idea that he could afford to travel around Europe at that time and be with the smartest people. And during that time, he actually studied under some of the leading lights of the Enlightenment. John Flamsteed was an astronomer, and he studied under him. He participated in groups, thought groups that included Isaac Newton and Edmund Halley of comet fame. And areas of interest that he was really interested in were geology and botany. And then he returned to Sweden and had to get a job, like we all do. We have, you know, he does his youthful traveling. He had to get a job, and he got it under a then very famous inventor and an engineer named Christopher Pullum. And that engineer introduced him to the King of Sweden, Charles XII. And the king was very impressed with Swedenborg's intellect, and he made him an advisor to the Board of Mines. So you'll see this mining thing keeps coming up again and again. And being an advisor to the Board of Mines, that, you know, that was a significant role and a government role. So he gets a job, he lands a job that's valuable. And he's very intellectually astute. In fact, many of the studies of who are the smartest people in history will list Swedenborg. I just saw one before the class that listed him as one of the brightest people of all time. On a list of 40 people, he was listed as number 18. So super smart guy, and recognized for that and seen as a scientist. He started a journal called Daedalus Hi Boreas. And he really wanted that to stimulate the manufacturing industry of Sweden and help the economy. And so he did 6 issues of that over a number of years, and it covered things like mining, machinery, salt making. But very famously, he also drew one of the first images of an airplane. I think we do have a slide of that. Yeah, you can see that's his drawing of an airplane. And that drawing it had a model of that used to be in the Smithsonian. I'm not sure if it still is, in the Aeronautics Museum, because it's really one of the first machines where people are pedaling through the air to fly. So he's, you know, way ahead of his time. The magazine didn't have enough financial support and enough investors, so he discontinued publishing. So it's always interesting to see that everybody that you kind of respect and think about, they're all struggling with their cash flow and you know, making it work. He's an entrepreneur and he's trying to put it all together. So the magazine shuts down. But then he really does go into the scientific world and scientific research. And it's kind of mind-blowing, the sort of stuff that he did in science. He is credited with the first known anticipation of the neuron. He had prescient ideas on the brain, the cerebral cortex, the nervous system, pituitary gland, the frontal regions of the brain. So he was very much on the cutting edge of a lot of that type of thought. He also was, he came up with a theory sort of like along the lines of the Big Bang that was completely cutting edge. And Immanuel Kant would take some of his ideas and run with them. So he was very forward, very bright. And just as I was saying, you know, he's wrestling with his finances a little bit, probably because he couldn't keep the magazine going. His stepmother dies, and I had mentioned that she was from a wealthy iron producing family, and she really liked him. So he got a very nice endowment from his stepmother, and that really helped his finances. So good to have a wealthy stepmother who likes you when she dies. And then he's invited to be more involved with the Swedish government in this board of mines. And he gets a salary, which is another, you know, good sign that he wants. And one interesting tidbit about him is I looked to see about, like, you know, what kind of speeches he gave, because he's in the political world. He's dealing as on the, you know, the House of the House of Nobles and so forth, House of Lords equivalent. And he doesn't really speak. And it turns out he had a speech impediment, and he was very shy about doing public speaking, which may be one reason he wrote so much. He wrote more than, I think, almost anybody in that period, when you look at all the things that he wrote. So what about his personal life? This is often not covered at all in any of the biographies. It's just kind of, it's Swedenborg the scientist, Swedenborg the mystic, but and he was single. He never gets married. So one thing, you know, when you look back historically, you might wonder about, you know, was he gay? Was he straight? Did he have a personal life? We can tell from his history that he was a heterosexual man. He courted a 17-year-old woman that he sought to marry, a daughter of a bishop. She had 3 suitors and she picked somebody else. He was really disappointed. There were other women that he was interested in. In fact, later when he gets more involved with this idea that there's an afterlife, he believes that he'll be with his soulmate in the next life. So he does not get married. And he also kept a dream journal, and he tried to interpret it. I don't think, but I don't know, but I don't think he ever really wanted this published. And if you've ever kept like a private journal, you really don't want people to read it. So it's quite erotic in the dream journal. A lot of the dreams are sexual, which would be very natural. And they were so, when they were discovered, Swedenborgian scholars from around the world were kind of collecting all of Swedenborg's papers as much as they possibly could. And the Swedenborg Society of England hired a scholar, and I'm not kidding, what his name was, R.L. Taffel. So the same initials as mine. So he would be my grandfather's brother, was a Swedenborg scholar and was tasked with collecting all Swedenborg's writings. He translated the Swedenborg's Dream Journal and decided, this doesn't happen until like the 1870s, but he leaves out all the erotic stuff because he's convinced that people shouldn't read that. And then later it's republished in the 20th century, early 20th century, and those are included. So that's kind of an interesting side of Swedenborg that's often not brought up. So he had a social life. And there are certainly letters from his travels when he was younger that imply that he had a pretty, active life. I would say, I don't know if it was an active sex life or not, but it seemed like he was, the guy around town when he was younger too. So he has this personal life. Everything that you can read about him says he's extremely charming. Everybody really liked him and respected him. And he's rising up as a scholar, and he's printing a number of books on the basic principles of nature and metallurgical works, and getting a lot of respect for that. And then, as I mentioned, one of the things that really gets people's attention is his what's called a nebular hypothesis, and that's where he talks about how the world was created, and yeah, Immanuel Kant kind of takes that and runs with it. So it starts with Swedenborg. So one thing that's happening to him scientifically is he's getting really interested in the mind-body, mind-spirit connection. And this would be my interpretation, but I get the sense of someone who he's curious as a scientist, and he's saying to himself, science can discover everything, so let's find the soul, and where's the soul in the body? And that's one reason I think he was so interested in the brain and anatomy. And so he starts pursuing that, and he's getting, trying to use science and spirituality and trying to figure that out. And I think that curiosity helps open doors for him. But he continues writing scientific books, and I believe he wrote the first chemistry and physics books that were published. The first algebra book actually was published in Swedish, but he writes on chemistry and physics, but the first one on algebra. So again, highly respected scientist. So he's really interested in this connection of the soul and the senses. Like, how are they connected? He knows that there is a soul, he knows there are senses, and he's trying to trace that down. So about that time, when he's kind of open to that research, this would be in around 1743, seems to be sort of a turning point. He's around 55 years old. He starts having very intense visions at night, and he records these in his diary. And they revolve around, I guess the best way to say it, he's constantly feeling unworthy, and he's feeling sinful in the dreams. And in one dream, somebody asks him, did he have, is there, whoops. Yeah, during this time, he starts having a lot of dreams. One dream is that a person asks him, where's his health certificate? And he interprets that to say, like, are you worthy to move forward? And he's questioning his worthiness. It also probably relates to a time in his life where he was traveling to London during a plague, and he snuck off the boat, was arrested and almost executed. And it was only his connections with the government and his high status that protected him from being killed. So there was probably a connection with that dream. So in one of his first dreams, one of the dreams, he claims that heaven is being opened up to me. He sees God opening things to him, and he has an image of Jesus holding him, and so forth. So in a series of these dreams, he starts to, which he keeps track of, he says that he's entering into knowledge of the spiritual world. And at 56, he has another one where he sees a big machine that's set in motion, and the spokes are all entangled, and they're carrying him up and pulling him around. And he interpreted that to believe that he was too caught up in what people thought of him, and too caught up in his just general business life and work life, that he needed to focus on this new path of spirituality. And then dramatically around Easter, he has an experience of Christ in his bedroom, and he shakes and falls off his bed, and he considers this dream, this image, this experience, this mystical experience, as his calling to a new path, which is to unlock spiritual truths. And but he's not sure exactly how to do that. He has other dreams where his father comes and cuts ribbons off his cuffs, and he looks at that as his father blessing his new work that he's doing. A father who was not as happy that he was going into the sciences, and now he's going down the spiritual path. So he has these visions, and they're not just at night. He has them also in the day, sometimes when he's fully awake. And I think that's kind of interesting. And then so he also speaks about using breathing exercises to get into the states, which was, not very common thing that was really understood in Europe at that time, but he had a spiritual practice with breathing. Then he has another vision when he's in London at a tavern, and I always remember this one because I think of it all the time when I'm eating. But of all the things that a spirit could say to him, he sees a spirit, sort of kind out of the corner of his eye, but he does hear a voice that says, "Do not eat too much." Of all the things a spirit could say, it's like, take care of your physical body. So he panics, he runs home, and then he has visions that night that are opened up to him. So those are just some of the examples of how he's going into this more mystical period of his life. And then he believes that what he's called to do is he's transported, he sees in some of his trips, he sees heaven, he sees hell, he meets with angels, and he records all of this. And one of the big insights that he gets is that the Bible is the word. The Bible is very important, and it's important because it operates not just at the level you read it, but it also operates at a level where the symbols mean something. All the symbols mean something. And he sees the entire universe as connected. Everything that happens in heaven corresponds to things happening on earth, and nature is full of symbolic spiritual correspondences. And the Bible has a code to it that you can read at a deeper level. And that he argues that you don't read the Old Testament, particularly the early parts of the Old Testament, are not meant to be read literally, as people did at that time, but they were meant to be symbolic stories that would be guiding our spiritual life. So he's got this spiritual, mystical path taking place. Meanwhile, back at the job where he pays the bills, I guess that the money he inherited was enough, because at that point he's raised up to a higher level in this board of mines as a first counselor, and he turns it down. And it's a very prestigious appointment. But he turns it down because he says, it's really time for me to switch into focusing totally on the spiritual path and not the mining world. So I think that's interesting, because all of us are kind of torn by, our paychecks and what we think is our genius or our spiritual path or our purpose. And Swedenborg was no different. He was trying to figure out how to pay the bills, and fortunately had some family money, it looks like. And but he felt very much that he was being guided to focus on spiritual writing. And spiritual writing, these spiritual books he writes from 1749 through 1756. This book, Secrets of Heaven, where he tries to spell out this deeper meaning, particularly of the books of Genesis and Exodus. And he produces these, and I assume he thinks these are like groundbreaking insights, and he goes to publish them. He underwrites all the cost himself, so there's no grift here. He's not trying to make some money, and he publishes them anonymously, and he sends them around to notable people, and the book does not sell. Shocker, right? A really deep spiritual book. And if you've tried to read Swedenborg, he's complicated, I think, because he's writing in Latin, and then Latin, for us, Latin to English. And it was probably much more direct, what he was trying to say, but it's a little dense. He constantly is referencing scripture throughout it. Like, he's got the footnotes in the text that can make it hard to read, but the books don't sell. There's different times he shares how disappointed he is that nobody's paying attention really to this new code that he calls correspondences between symbolic words in the Bible and their deeper meaning. And so it does not take off. And he kind of thought it would just be the most incredible thing. And so then he writes about the structure of heaven. He writes about angels and devils and the body soul connection. And he's very focused on the connection between love and truth, or faith and charity, or love and wisdom. That combination is how he sees God. He writes a whole book about that. We'll get more into his theology in the future class, but tonight we're just doing his biography. And maybe because the books weren't really selling, or maybe he was for whatever reason, he stops really with Exodus and he goes back to London in 1758, and he publishes a book called Heaven and Hell, and it describes the afterlife in in great detail, the inhabitants, what they're doing, where they live. And this is by far his most popular book, and it's very accessible. You can pick it up and you can kind of say, oh, what happens to babies? And you can just look at you don't have to read the whole thing. You can just read that section. So it's really easy to read a section. It was people were fascinated by it. They didn't know. My sense is they didn't know who published it. And today we have a lot of near-death experience stories that give pictures of life after death. That was a lot less so in his time. So he is kind of, I would say one of the pioneers or grandfathers of that near-death movement, where he describes in much greater detail than most of those what happens next. But the near-death experience community very much, if you look at their website, reinforces what he describes happens at death. And that book by far is the one that catches on with people and becomes much more popular. And the reasons he's publishing it in London, I think, would be two reasons. One, the heresy laws in his home country, Sweden, were quite brutal around the Lutheran Church. And England is seen as like the intellectual capital of the world, London, and it's very open-minded and there's free thought. So he publishes them there. I think those would be the reasons. We'll get more into his thoughts in future sections, but I'll just say that probably one of his most controversial insights from his trips to heaven and hell and the Last Judgment is that that nobody's condemned to hell, and heaven is much easier to get into, but it's really a choice that we make in the life we live on earth. That was a radical idea. And the other thing that would be very controversial is he says that in the book of Revelations, the coming of Christ into the world is not a physical return of Jesus, as most churches today are waiting for, coming down from the heavens. He said it's a spiritual evolution that will be in a new spiritual age of humankind that begins at this in 1757. So that there's going to be a new unfolding, and he's predicting that governments are going to change and human rights are going to change, and there's going to be just dramatic shift in the world over the centuries following this period, and that's quite controversial. We'll get more into his views on spirituality, but I will say the Protestant church had a view of the Trinity and described it very often in almost polytheistic, but like three in one, one in three, but talked about them as separate entities. And he was critical of that and said that we had to focus on the unity of God, and that became really something that really angered the churches, and as they read his books, as they spread. One of the things about him that was far ahead of his time was he was a critic of slavery, and he's considered the first prominent Swedish person to condemn it. And he argued, based on his insights, that people from sub-Saharan Africa were superior to Europeans in their connection to God, and condemned European missionaries for the way they were approaching it. Other big controversial thing that he believed was that there was life on other planets. That was controversial then, it would be controversial now. So that's kind of a sense of who he was. That's kind of a sense of what he was writing. The other things that were happening in his life at that time that got a lot of attention and kind of broke him out of obscurity in this realm was that he started becoming what some people would be called a seer. Today you might call him a medium, although Swedenborgians don't like that connect that word connected to him, but he had the ability to see things on the other side. And that became evident where he had the ability to see things where he was not present. And so I think one of the most famous ones is in 1759 when he's at a dinner party in I think it's Gothenburg, and he's 250 miles away. And in the middle of the dinner, he jumps up, he runs to the balcony, and he's kind of in a panic. And people are like, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And he said, "Stockholm is on fire." So Stockholm's 250 miles away. And there's no way it could have been reported because it took 2 hours to report any news. And he's in a panic because he has all of his writings in his place in Stockholm at this time, and he can see the fire coming down the street. And then he just says, "Oh, they extinguished it, just 3 doors down from my house." So he's relieved. And people are kind of like looking at him sideways because there's no news of a fire there. And then a couple of days later, messengers from Stockholm arrive at the town and confirmed that there was a fire and that it had stopped just short of his house. That story seems to have gotten a lot of attention. There was a lot of prominent people that really got a buzz about Swedenborg. That was and it buzzed around Sweden. It buzzed around continental Europe. And that's when people also started to connect these anonymous books that he had written with him. So that's really the first time he's connected to his books publicly. And then he writes his next book, and one of his most controversial books, about marriage love, and he puts his name on it. So he's connecting himself. So that experience put him in the public eye. Another story that came to light was a widow of a French ambassador to Sweden. Had a very expensive silver set that she bought, and she paid, but the people who sold it to her husband said, you need to pay for the silver set. And she said, "I'm sure my husband did, but I can't find the receipt." And so something as small as that, but she asked Swedenborg for help because he was getting known as being connected. And so, and then he reaches out to the other side, and she has a dream and finds exactly where it's located. And that story also gets a lot of attention. She's a prominent person in the elite social world. And so she's like, this guy's connected. And then finally, 1761, he's at the court of the Queen of Sweden, and she asked him to relay a question to her deceased brother, Prince August Wilhelm of Prussia. And he comes back, I guess a couple of weeks later, and shares with her something, and we don't know what it was, but she announces that only my brother could have known that. So this guy is connected to the other side. So those 3 stories become kind of famous. And so he does switch in the moment from being the well-known scientist to this seer that people can go to, and people do travel to him to get help and connect. And evidently he was somewhat open-minded, but he really didn't want to, he got very tired of it, I guess, and he didn't want to just constantly be putting on a show. So he ratcheted that back and continued his writing. But that did get a lot of attention, and those became very famous stories at the time. Well, now that we know that he is the publisher of those theological books that I was telling you about, and that he published them, in Latin, in London or Amsterdam, they eventually got to the attention of the Lutheran State Church, and there was a heresy trial for Swedenborg's writing. Already people started following Swedenborg's writings. He never created a church, but there were followers. And so those 2 of his followers were put up on trial for heresy charges. And Swedenborg personally, when he heard of it, he was just furious. He wrote to the king. So he's a very connected guy. And the case was pretty much dropped, and nothing happened. But it did definitely put a chill on within the Lutheran Church of reading Swedenborg's writings in Sweden. And so you wouldn't really see a Swedenborgian community gathering in Sweden for another 100 years. And so in reaction to those charges, he writes his last book, True Christianity, and he sort of systematically tries to show a comparison between what he sees as the new Christian church versus the old Christian church. And he refers to the new church and the new Jerusalem as not just, and then in this new age, as not something limited to Christians, but it will be open to all humanity. It'll be a new age, new understanding, a new evolution in the world, and that would be coming into being in the world. So then he's in London in the late 1771. He has a stroke that year, and then he kind of recovers. And there's a famous story that John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, is also in London at that time. And Swedenborg is told that Wesley wants to talk to him from angels. So he reaches out to Wesley, and Wesley, yes, I did want to talk to you. And he says, but I have to go to the United States, and when I get back, I'll talk to you. And he says, no, if it's after March 29th, I won't be in this world anymore. I'll travel to the next world. So he knew he would be passing. He knew the date, and he was greeted. He was a Lutheran minister, did come to be with him for sort of last rites, and said, at this point, he's now had the heresy issue, and a lot of people would just say he was insane, like he just lost it. And so many of the people, like this pastor that visited him at the end, said, if you'll just, say everything was a mistake, you'll be forgiven. And if you say you made it up and it's not true, you could be forgiven for this. And he says, as truly as you see me before your eyes, so true is everything I've written. I could have said more had it been permitted. When you enter in eternity, you will see everything. And then you and I shall have much to talk about. And then he dies shortly thereafter. Important point about Swedenborg, he does not start a church. He does not see himself as a religious leader in the sense of charting a church in the traditional sense or denomination. That was not on his agenda. So that's a very interesting, I think, point. And the other is that one interesting, just little tidbit about his life, he is buried in London. He's later moved to Sweden. But in those days, I suppose there was this thing about if you could collect someone's skull, you could have their intelligence. He was known as one of the most intelligent men of the period. So his skull was evidently stolen from his tomb. And it was, somebody had it at some store. Evidently, a fake skull was put in. And in 1957, there was DNA, testing you could actually do. And they found out that it was actually the wrong skull that was placed in his tomb, and they found the right one and they reunited it. So I just think that's kind of a weird story, but it shows kind of how much people were kind of interested in Swedenborg's brains. They literally tried to capture it through that. So that's kind of an interesting after-death story. And he has now, his remains now exist in Sweden. So with that, I will stop with my story of Swedenborg, trying to boil down many books into a presentation, and I am open up to any questions or comments that people have.
I was wondering if you had read anything in this last book that you mentioned, True Christianity. It sounded interesting to me, but what I've read of Swedenborg directly, it's been kind of inaccessible for me, a little bit difficult. Do you know if that one's as hard as some of his others?
I think I have read it, and it's very like an apologetic where you're kind of arguing your side. So it's kind of a little bit easier to read, I think, where he kind of, and it's clearly, he's clearly reacting to something, which if you're not so much in the time, you're wondering, why is he arguing? So he's, so I think that's a little bit more accessible than some of the other stuff, definitely. I would say Heaven and Hell and that.
Thank you for that beautiful and thorough overview, Rich. My question was, what was Swedenborg's relationship with organized religion before he had all of these visions? Are you aware of his relationship with God and his ideas there? Was there a disenchantment with that? And
It doesn't look like he was. I think he was just like your typical son of a Lutheran bishop. He was, he was very. He does go to church, like a Lutheran church in London. He goes to church. He talks about various churches that he attends in the Lutheran Swedish community, and he's kind of plugged into that. So he has some sort of tension with his father, like, surprise, surprise, someone has a tension with father-son relationship. But who I think was disappointed that he went into the sciences, because that was a new path, and really had wished that he had gone into the clergy. And the clergy was a highly respected field in those days, unlike today. And it was not unusual for clergy families to get ennobled. That's how important they were to society. You would get that noble status. So I think he was really into it. I think he was into it in a pretty normal way, but I think his scientific mode really kicked in, and he was curious for deeper truths. And his scientific background kind of makes him uniquely able to, pursue what happens next. At some point, he says that at some point in some of his writings, he talks about, why was he not a minister to do this? And he really says it was better that he was a scientist than a minister to do this, and that the ministry could be the last group to get what he's talking about.
do you know if he continued attending church after having these visions and writing about them?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I know that in some of the passages I read, he'll say like so-and-so is where the church that I attended. So I don't know how frequent it was, but he does have like a garden house in Sweden where he eventually kind of retires to write. And he just seems to be writing from morning till night. And he is probably one of the most prolific writers of the 18th century in terms of numbers of books. I think it's, well over 20 books. And he just seems like, if you have that image of somebody, he often had servants to bring in food. He did in London. And so like they often talk about like bringing in, coffee and something to eat. And he morning to night writing and writing and writing. And some of those people also report that they do hear him talking to other people while he's in the other room. Any other questions? Comments?
Yeah.
Oh,
Go ahead.
oh, sorry. So my question was, maybe this is too broad a question, so I don't know, but what was his what was his opinions of like government, the state, politics, as it relates to his faith? Like you mentioned his involvement with politics. Did he see that as important to his faith, and as important to like bringing in this new era? Or is that kind of like a separate realm of activity, I guess?
I would say he's very he's sort of politically probably, I would say, conservative. He's at that time, he's kind of, he comes up in a privileged background, right, of the noble families, and he's very deferential to the royal family. And so he's friends with the kings and the queens that are passing through in the Swedish government. He's a part of the nobles, the House of Lords kind of deal. So that means he's in that's the group he's in. They tend to be more conservative. So he seems very much, he talks about war, for example, and says that it's wrong for a country to initiate war, and but it's appropriate to fight. His country was engaging in wars at that time and losing them and losing land, and some really, catastrophic losses for Sweden at that time. But he, at one point, they need to move boats across Sweden for a battle, and he creates the machinery, the plan to move the boats across. So he's very practical, and that's what the administration admired about him. He also drew he invented in a drawing a machine gun, a gun that could shoot many things at once. So I think he was, he's, it's interesting if you believe, so he says like this new period's coming into being and the whole thing's going to change. And he's talking about the rights of Africans and equality and these things. And this is, he dies 1772. And of course, we see the American and French Revolution just after that. So it's a big change. But, and he talks about England in the ways that I think people might have talked shortly thereafter about the United States. Like he's like, this is where you have the free ideas and freedom. And he really likes London and the freedom and the ideas. So that's how I best categorize him politically. But it's important for me, like he's very involved in government. Every day he's showing up and he's in a government job. So that's what's kind of cool, that he's a mystic, but he's also traveling in the daily job of, bringing home a check that he had to do. So does that answer it?
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. Thank you.
That's my take. I don't know that anybody's written about that, but maybe somebody has.
I thought it was very interesting what you were mentioning about his vision about the world to come and how he envisions the second coming. And it's very similar. I mean, many of the principles he's talking about are very similar to what's in the Baha'i faith. I mean, similarly, the Baha'i faith believes that basically the second coming, it's really the spiritual evolution of the world, of humanity, and also the fact that Swedenborg was considering actually Africans as being really special people spiritually. I mean, you find the same thing in the Baha'i faith. And actually the prophets of the Baha'i faith came into the world, pretty soon after the death of Swedenborg, about 30 years, I believe, after his death. So, I'm a little bit familiar with multiple different religions, and it seems to me Swedenborg was kind of really announcing the coming of the Baha'i prophets, which would, really continue upon the principles which were proposed by Swedenborg, and it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I've always known the Baha'i faith's theology was very much aligned with Swedenborg. And Swedenborg does in some of his writings say, like, there are people, and he says, like in the Tardher area or off the coast of India, like very unique, strange places he's never been to, that have a connection to the word at a very deep level. And they've kept it going, and they're going to be critical in the new church. So that could be very possible what we're talking about. But someone asked me the connection between Swedenborgianism and Baha'i at church a few weeks ago, and I was shocked, I guess, or not, I shouldn't be, but that the founder of the Baha'i faith in the United States was a Swedenborgian. And he attended the World Parliament of Religions in 1893 that was hosted, a concept by a Swedenborgian, and that he had been a Swedenborgian, and he did not like the Swedenborg's focus on Jesus so much, and this person, and Mary, the Virgin, some of the miracles of Jesus' life, and just so that's where he preferred the Baha'i faith. But yeah, theologically extremely similar. And also, I'll just say, like, a lot of the things that he said then that were so radical and heretical are not as much today. Quick example would be, my grandmother was from Germany. My grandfather met her when he was stationed there after World War I. She was Catholic, and she was terrified that when you die, your body goes into the ground and it stays there forever until a judgment day. And that's what she found that terrifying. And she loved the idea that Swedenborg said, no, 3 days you transfer into heaven, or your spiritual world. I don't know many churches today that still hold that. It's much less common to hear anybody still hold that was a very common belief. So a lot of the things that he said that were so radical, they have happened. in Christianity. They've already changed. Even ecumenicism, which again was not a thing then in those days. When he's around, there's heresy trials. There's people being executed for their beliefs on the Trinity by John Calvin and by the Lutherans in those days. Today, yeah, everybody's very ecumenically focused in the Christian church. So yeah. We've got a few more minutes before we wrap up, but that's a great question and great connection. And I'm glad you found that, Emmanuel. And Emmanuel, what a great name, right? For a study of Swedenborg. Anybody else have a comment or question from the biography of Swedenborg?
Has Swedenborg ever heard of Rumi or other mystics at the time of his life?
That's a good question. We did an event at the church with Rumi Forum on Rumi Swedenborg, and we were stunned just the similarities. I don't have any record of him talking about Rumi, and in those days, I don't think ideas spread the same way across countries. But there's definitely, when you read Kabbalah in Judaism, and you read Sufi leaders in Islam, the connections are, the mystics are all saying very similar things across faiths. And they actually have more in common with each other than they do within their own faith. So there's sort of a common connection there. But I don't think he read him. Like, for example, he doesn't really mention Buddhism because it's clearly something he wouldn't have a lot of connection to. But he does say in heaven he sees, Buddhist, Asian communities. In fact, there's one funny story where if I'm remembering this correctly, I think it's a Buddhist community meets him and he says he's from the Christian church, and the Buddhist community says, "Oh, how sad! You're part of the group that had the truth about spirituality, but you guys never lived it out in your in the world." And we kind of lived it in our faith, and now we're learning more about it. But so Christianity had a bad, according to that story, if I'm summarizing it accurately, that Christianity had a bad rap in the next life, as like they were given the key and they didn't really live up to it. So that was kind of funny. And with that, I think we're going to just wrap up. So we'll do this again for the next 3 weeks. You'll see if you can just check the syllabus if you want to read something. If you don't, just join. If you have questions, people are watching this online. A number of people are watching this online. So if you have questions, send it to us on the church website, and I will include answer your questions in the next session. But with that, I'm going to let everybody go onto their day. Thank you for joining our first one on the biography of Emanuel Swedenborg. Thank you, everybody.